Welcome back to the channel. What if the Black Death never happened? Imagine waking up in a world where one of the deadliest events in human history never happened. No mass graves, no deserted villages, no sudden silence sweeping across Europe. Now here's the unsettling part. What if the modern world you live in, your job, your freedoms, your technology, even the idea of human rights only exists because the Black Death happened? Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people, wiping out 30 to 60% of Europe's population. It was catastrophic. But historians now agree on something deeply uncomfortable. Out of that unimaginable horror came transformations that reshaped civilization itself. So tonight, let's run a dangerous thought experiment. Are you ready? What if the Black Death never happened? Would humanity be better off or trapped in a darker, slower, more unequal world? The answer isn't obvious, and it changes everything. Before we imagine a plague-free timeline, we need to understand the world before the Black Death. Because medieval Europe wasn't just different, it was fragile. Let me explain. By the early 1300s, Europe was overcrowded. Population growth had outpaced food production. Most people lived at the edge of starvation. A single bad harvest could mean famine. In fact, Europe had already been weakened by the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed millions and left survivors malnourished and vulnerable. Society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top, kings, nobles, and the church. At the bottom, peasants bound to the land through feudalism, with little freedom and almost no chance of social mobility. Labor was cheap. Human life was cheaper. Now pause here, because this is where things get interesting. If the Black Death never arrives, this system doesn't collapse, it continues. And that continuity changes everything that comes after. When the plague hit, it didn't just kill people, it broke the economy. With entire villages wiped out, there simply weren't enough workers left. Fields went unplowed, workshops stood empty. Lords who once controlled armies of peasants suddenly had no one to harvest their crops. For the first time in centuries, labor became valuable. Survivors could demand higher wages. Peasants abandoned their lords and moved to towns. Feudal obligations weakened. In England, attempts to freeze wages through laws like the Statute of Laborers of 1351 failed miserably. The balance of power had shifted, and it would never fully shift back. Now ask yourself this: if the Black Death never happened, who would have forced that change? Without mass death, labor stays abundant, wages stay low, feudalism stays strong, not for decades, but potentially for centuries longer. The rise of the middle class delayed, workers' rights delayed, economic mobility rare, almost non-existent. The world becomes stable, but deeply unequal. But the plague didn't just alter economics, it shook something far more powerful: belief. During the Black Death, people prayed, they obeyed the church, they begged for salvation, and still they died. Priests died, monks died, entire religious orders vanished. The church, which claimed divine authority and protection, could not stop the disease. This created a spiritual crisis unlike anything Europe had experienced. Faith didn't disappear, but doubt was born. People began asking dangerous questions. If God controlled everything, why spare the sinful and kill the devout? If the church spoke for God, why was it powerless? That skepticism didn't explode overnight, but it planted a seed, one that would later grow into the Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually modern secular thought. Now imagine a world without that shock. Without the Black Death, the Church's authority remains largely unchallenged. There's no mass failure, no visible collapse of divine order. The intellectual monopoly holds. Science advances more slowly. Questioning authority becomes rarer. Independent thought remains dangerous. The modern idea of separating faith from governance may never fully emerge. And that leads us to another turning point most people never connect to the plague: innovation. When labor was suddenly scarce, societies had a problem. How do you produce the same amount of food, goods, and infrastructure with fewer people? You invent. The post-plague world saw rapid adoption of labor-saving technologies, improved plows, water mills, windmills, and later, early mechanization. Efficiency wasn't an option, it was survival. Cities expanded, trade networks adapted, knowledge moved faster. But without the plague, there's no urgency. Why innovate when labor is cheap and plentiful? Why invest in machines when human hands cost almost nothing? Technological progress slows, not stops, but drags. And when innovation slows, so does everything else. Exploration, industry, medicine, and eventually the scientific revolution itself. Now here's where the thought experiment takes a darker turn. The Black Death didn't affect all regions equally. Europe was devastated. Other parts of the world, like parts of Asia and the Middle East, were affected differently. Europe's population crash temporarily reduced pressure on land and resources. Diets improved. Living standards rose for survivors. This set the stage for long-term economic growth. If Europe remains overcrowded and resource-starved, it may never gain the momentum that later allowed it to dominate global trade and exploration. That means no age of discovery as we know it, no rapid European expansion, no global empires built on European power. This sounds positive, until you consider the alternative. Without shifts in power, older empires may dominate longer. Technological stagnation spreads globally. Colonialism might still occur, but under different, possibly more brutal systems. History doesn't become kinder, it just becomes different. There's another uncomfortable truth historians point out. The Black Death indirectly accelerated individualism. With death everywhere, people rewrote wills, inherited land, and moved freely. Women, in some regions, gained economic opportunities due to labor shortages. Survivors began to see life as fragile and personal choices as meaningful. Art changed. Literature became more human-centered. Death, time, and identity became personal themes. Without that existential shock, culture remains rigidly collective, tradition-bound, and resistant to change. The idea that your life belongs to you takes longer to form, if it forms at all. Now bring this forward. Democracy, human rights, labor laws, scientific inquiry, modern medicine. None of these appeared overnight, but all of them were shaped by a long chain reaction that begins uncomfortably with mass death. So what if the Black Death never happened? You might live in a world that's more stable, but far less free, more orderly, but deeply stratified, safer from pandemics, but slower, quieter, and more controlled. And here's the final twist. The Black Death didn't just change history because people died. It changed history because systems failed under pressure. When institutions collapse, humanity adapts. Without collapse, power calcifies. So the real question isn't whether the Black Death was good or necessary. It was a tragedy, on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. But it forces us to confront an unsettling idea. Progress doesn't always come from comfort. Sometimes it comes from catastrophe. And if that's true, what parts of our modern world exist only because something terrible once happened? That's not a comforting question, but it's a necessary one. If you want more untold, uncomfortable, and forgotten turns in history, stories that challenge what we think we know, subscribe and stay curious. because the past is never as simple as it looks. Thank you for listening. This is Ren, and until next time, when we uncover more forgotten history, goodbye.